Okay, colleagues. So I'm having a fairly sleepy and lazy Sunday. It's a lot of things I should be doing, but um, don't particularly feel like doing any of them. So I thought, you know, uh, I'd repeat yesterday's experience and read some more from Cahn. Hopefully this is a useful thing, or will prove useful to you, or at least maybe to me in the coming years. Anyway, so I want to read an introduction to Thomas Hobbes, and the introduction actually is by Jean Hampton. So, you know, Jean Hampton, you might have heard the name, right? So, Jean Elizabeth Hampton unfortunately died at a very young age, at the age of 41. She died in 1996, prematurely. Which is a great loss to Hobbesian scholarship, but still, she's a recognized authority in the field, and of course, she has a book, she has all these other things. But she also writes an introduction in Cahn to Hobbes. It's a fairly short introduction, but I think it does, especially in a very superficial and oversimplified manner, capture some of the things that she has to say about Hobbes. So let me jump right into it. Let's start reading. So. Anyway, so Thomas Hobbes, born in Malmesbury, um, arriving prematurely, because of the rumors of the Spanish Armada off the coast of England, and the famous quote that Hobbes's mother brought twins to birth, myself, Hobbes, and fear at the same time. So ironically, fear of death was the central psychological assumption of his moral and political theorizing as an adult. Hobbes's father was a clergyman, whom some reports describe as prone to drink and violence, who eventually deserted his family to avoid a charge of assault. Education was at the expense of his uncle. Hobbes attended Oxford, etc., etc. Is this important? Well, if you were writing a dissertation, maybe, but within the short space of 1,000 words, it's not much, I think, to devote to Hobbes's biography, but maybe a couple of words. Anyway, so because he was not from a wealthy family, on graduation, Hobbes got a job as the tutor and companion of William Cavendish, who eventually became the Earl of Devonshire. Thus began Hobbes's long association with that family. Except for a few brief periods, he remained in service to them for nearly 70 years. He also worked briefly for Sir Francis Bacon, serving as his, wow, amanuensis, wonderful word, and translator. So the connection between Hobbes and Bacon is, in principle, kind of interesting, especially because Bacon was a big fan of Machiavelli and actually wrote certain Machiavellian works of political philosophy. But again, how much of this are you going to write about in the University of London? Probably not much, or not at all. Anyway, so according to his friend and biographer John Aubrey, Hobbes's philosophical interest owed much to the geometer Euclid. Now, this I think is kind of more interesting. So we see this Hobbes trying to emulate the geometrical method in his work. So Euclid's proofs, which Hobbes loved, because of the way they relied on logical reasoning to derive surprising and sometimes seemingly implausible conclusions from highly plausible and seemingly innocuous premises. However, Hobbes's first full-scale philosophical manuscript was not circulated until 1640. This work, called Elements of Law, Natural and Politic, and again, this tripartite structure, so Elements of Law, the Chiva, and Leviathan. Excellent students among you should already be aware of the distinctions between the three, which are not much, but of some significance. Anyway, so the Elements of Law advocated the creation of an absolute sovereign, so already from the very beginning, absolute sovereign, in order to secure the peace and stability of the community. Because of the anti-royalist sentiment at this time, the peace and stability of the community. Because of the anti-royalist sentiment at this time, which eventually resulted in a full-scale civil war and the beheading of the King Charles I, many people, including members of parliament, were outraged by the manuscript, and Hobbes believed he had to flee for his life to Europe. He used to boast that he was one of the first to flee from England. Anyway, like many prominent royalist sympathizers, he spent the rest of the Civil War in Paris, where he enjoyed philosophical conversations with the French intellectuals such as Gassendi and Mersenne. Gassendi, famous for his Epicurean sympathies, and exiled British thinkers. During that time, he wrote The Achiever and the Citizen, a reworked version of his argument in the Elements of War, written in Latin but later published in English in 1651 under the title The Philosophical Rudiments of Government. In 1651, he published his masterpiece, Leviathan, which contains his mature argument for absolute sovereignty. Let me just very briefly mention that, of course, this publication in 3 waves might be responsible for some of the inconsistencies in the Leviathan itself. Klosko, for example, points out that probably there are certain passages which Hobbes simply forgot to change, that his argument changed from the Elements of Law to the Leviathan, but this is not actually reflected. So, again, and we see this thought in Boucher as well, that against Michael Oakeshott, probably the work is best not read as a single unified whole, but actually as maybe something of a mishmash of different arguments. Anyway, back to the text. Oliver Cromwell was in power when Leviathan was completed, and Cromwell supposedly welcomed the book because of the way its arguments could be used to justify any de facto political authority, a very important phrase, de facto political authority, even if it was installed through rebellion. Accordingly, Hobbes was allowed to come home, unlike other royalist exiles, who resented Hobbes' return and considered him to have sold out to the new Puritan regime. Again, Hobbes managed to piss off everyone, and he sort of writes this in the introduction to the Leviathan, that it's hard to pass between the 2, horns unscathed, 2 horns being people who want too much liberty and people who want too much authority. So against rebellious liberals of the day on the one hand, and against sort of hardcore royalist supporters of the divine right of kings. Anyway, on his return, he continued philosophizing in areas other than political philosophy, producing works in philosophy of law, history, metaphysics, and epistemology, including ontology, scientific method, and free will, and topics in science and mathematics, including optics, geometry, and human physiology. Is this important? Probably not. After the restoration of King Charles II, Hobbes enjoyed access to the king because of his wit and intelligence. However, he remained a highly controversial figure throughout the country, both because of his political absolutism and because of his materialistic metaphysics and his views on free will and religion, which were viewed by many of the large population as atheistic and heretical. Hobbes died at the ripe old age of 91. Unthinkable. Really, well, I don't want to say unthinkable, but very rare for the time. Anyway, Hobbes' argument for absolute sovereignty. So now, this is all blah, blah, blah. Now starts something more interesting. So Hampton is going to give a brief summary and then some criticisms. Anyway, so Hobbes' argument for absolute sovereignty in all his political writings makes use of the idea of a social contract. So again, social contract is a phrase that can be applied to Hobbes. Here you see Gene Hampton, a famous scholar, using this phrase with respect to Hobbes, so don't hesitate. So Hobbes also uses the words covenant and other words, but social contract is good enough. Idea of social contract, an idea also used by other political thinkers of his day, but which Hobbes revolutionized in ways that powerfully influenced the political thinking of subsequent philosophers such as Locke, Rousseau, and Kant. Imagine, says Hobbes, a state of nature prior to the creation of all governments. In this state, human behavior would be unchecked by law. And since Hobbes believed that human beings are predominantly self-interested, concerned above all else with their own preservation, he argues that they would inevitably come into conflict with one another, while having little or no other regarding sentiments or psychological resources to resolve those conflicts. So before long, he says, there would be a war of everyone against everyone, so that every person's life in this natural state would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To remedy such war and satisfy their desire for self-preservation, people, Hobbes argues, would be rational to contract with one another to create a government. Whoops. Yeah. Next page. Yeah. So Hobbes argued people would be rational to contract with one another to create a government run by a sovereign holding absolute power, because only absolute power is sufficient to resolve disputes that otherwise would precipitate conflict, dissolving the commonwealth and threatening the lives of all. So again, nothing short of absolute power can secure peace. That's the idea. Such an argument is meant to show the kind of government we, contemporary human beings, would be rational to create and sustain, lest we descend into a state of war analogous to the one that would exist in the state of nature. Note that Hobbes does not require that sovereignty be held only by an absolute monarchy, an important point, right? So we aren't just talking about absolute monarchy. He also recognizes that sovereignty can be invested in a small number of people, constituting an oligarchy, or in all the people, constituting a democracy. Hobbes explicitly prefers the absolute monarchy, but believes the other two forms of government are also viable. This is important. What is not viable, in his view, is some form of mixed government with different branches of government holding different components of political authority, or governments in which power is supposed to be limited by a constitution or by a contract made between the government and the people. Such limits or divisions, says Hobbes, will only lead to conflicts that cannot be resolved by self-interested people who require for peace a unified sovereignty with the power to decide any issue that might lead to conflict in the regime. So again, nothing short of absolute sovereignty can guarantee peace. That's the idea. Let's continue. Hobbes's use of this social contract argument was occasioned in large part by his rejection of the scholastic philosophizing of many of his contemporaries and his forebearers, who he thought were too inclined to appeal to authority rather than reason, and too inclined to use nonsensical or empty terms such as immaterial substance or consubstantiation. Accordingly, Hobbes turned to science, and particularly to geometry, as a guide to constructing a theory of our moral and political life. Starting with what he took to be sound premises, Hobbes sought to construct a social contract argument so as to derive, in a geometric fashion, valid conclusions about morals and politics in a way that would command assent even from those reluctant to endorse such conditions. Hobbes's faith in the power of reason, Hobbes's faith in the power of reason to provide truth in moral and political matters makes him an Enlightenment thinker, although ironically, it is in part because he thinks that there will be persistent failures of rationality in any human community, that peace must be secured by giving the ruler absolute power. So again, in some sense, we need absolutism because human rationality, human reason is limited. Our capacity for rational consensus is limited. Like this is something one possible interpretation of the fool's problem, that I should not actually trust. Okay, so my microphone died. I hope that this is going to be audible. We're almost finished. Anyway, so here's the most important bit. Does Hobbes's argument work? To create an absolute sovereign, Hobbes says that each person must agree with every other person to give up his or her right to all things, to the sovereign, thereby authorizing the sovereign to rule in this community. But can people who are committed to securing their self-preservation above all else rationally risk giving up all their rights to another? Hobbes explicitly compares subjects to servants and sovereigns to masters. But is such voluntary political enslavement even psychologically possible for people as Hobbes describes them? Important question. Now, this is University of London grade material, something you should definitely mention in your exam. Observant readers will note qualifications to this alienation of all power to the sovereign in chapter 21. Chapter 21. For example, Hobbes writes, the obligation of subjects to the sovereign is understood to last as long as and no longer than the power lasts by which he is able to protect them. For the right that men have by nature to protect themselves, when none else can protect them, can be no covenant relinquished. But so here's the key question that Gene Hampton asked, and I remind you that this is one of the this is not the only, but one of the main assertions, one of the main reasons to bring Hampton into the discussion on the University of London, because Hampton questions the possibility of absolute sovereignty in Hobbesian terms. And here's what she says. But is such a qualification consistent with the idea that the sovereign has absolute power over his subject? So is this notion that I am free to break the covenant, sort of not break the covenant, but I am free to decide that the covenant is void in case my life is not being protected, is this capacity on my part, is it compatible with absolute sovereignty anyway? But is such qualification consistent with the idea that sovereign has absolute power over his subjects? The ultimate validity of Hobbes's argument has been questioned by generations of readers, including Hampton herself, who have tended to be both intrigued by the power of his argument and alarmed by its conclusions. So Hampton herself, to oversimplify, thinks that Hobbes is being inconsistent, and one possible way to resolve this is to say that authority necessarily has to be limited, but I don't want to go into this right here. Anyway, so this was a short presentation as I intended, and hopefully people are going to find this useful. And let me sign off.